Good morning, everyone. My name is Varun Soni, and I'm the Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life here at the University of Southern California, where I also serve as Vice Provost of Campus Wellness and Crisis Intervention, and where I teach courses in the School of Religion and the Chan Division of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to moderate this keynote session with all of you today. I'm especially grateful to Jeffrey Gold and Eric and Aaron Anick for their heroic efforts in making this conference possible. And a special thank you to my friend and colleague and my wife's mentor, Dr. Mark Wiegensberg, who created the conditions over the last several years that made all of this possible. As many of you know, this morning marks the first day of the Indian festival of Diwali, which is the cultural celebration of the new year, and which has religious significance for Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, and Sikhs. Diwali is the festival of lights, and today hundreds of millions of Indians around the world will light lamps to commemorate the triumph of light over darkness and of good over evil. In ancient India, light was associated with knowledge, with insight, with enlightenment. And so when we light lamps for Diwali, we also light our own inner light, the light of wisdom, the light of hope, the light of divinity. And as we light candles, we become candles ourselves, using our own inner flame to light the candles of others and to illuminate a world filled with darkness. We all need some light in our lives and in our world right now. And so in that spirit, I wish you all a very peaceful and prosperous season of Diwali. And speaking of light, this morning's keynote session has been something I've been looking forward to for a very long time. It's been a beacon of light from afar for me, and I'm so happy it's finally here. It's not often you get to host an event with two of your heroes, but that's what I get to do with this keynote presentation this morning, featuring Dr. Deepak Chopra and Dr. Lisa Miller. The format of the keynote presentation will be as follows. Dr. Chopra will present for about 30 minutes, and then Dr. Miller will present for about 30 minutes. Following that, I'll moderate a fireside chat between Dr. Chopra and Dr. Miller, and I'll also be asking them questions from our audience today. So please make sure you submit your questions online. And we will conclude this keynote presentation by 10:45 a.m. this morning. For many years, dedicated physicians, researchers, and scientists have labored at USC to establish the Institute of Health and Wellness, and today's conference is really a culmination of many years of hard work by so many people. And what we noticed as we built this institute is that at almost every major research university in the United States, there are dedicated professionals who are doing what we're doing. They're building complementary and alternative medicine practices and modalities in their medical school and research institute communities. By bringing together ancient wisdom and modern science, these dedicated and inspired professionals move the entire medical research enterprise forward and create new spaces and new conversations for health, well-being, and flourishing. The explosion of interest in complementary and alternative medicine and its translation into clinical care and medical research are all possible because of the life and legacy of our first keynote speaker, Dr. Deepak Chopra. Indeed, more than anyone else in the world, Dr. Chopra has been on the front line of alternative and complementary medicine and of new forms and ways of healing and transformation. And what seems so mainstream today, from yoga to meditation to healthy eating to spiritual retreats to Ayurveda to essentially the entire wellness industry, is only mainstream because of the extraordinary work, sacrifice, advocacy, courage, and wisdom of Dr. Chopra. Without him, this field doesn't exist, there is no institute, and this conference doesn't happen. And so, Dr. Deepak Chopra is the founder of the Chopra Foundation, a nonprofit entity for research on well-being and humanitarianism, and Chopra Global, a modern-day health company at the intersection of science and spirituality. A world-renowned pioneer in integrative medicine and personal transformation. He is a clinical professor of family medicine and public health at the University of California, San Diego, and he serves as senior scientist with the Gallup organization. He is the author of over 90 books translated into over 40 languages, including numerous New York Times bestsellers. And Time magazine described him as one of the top 100 heroes and icons of the century. His new book, Total Meditation, Practices in Living the Awakened Life, offers all of us essential wisdom and insight on living the awakened life right now. And it's a wonderful gift for the holiday season for all of your loved ones. I'm so grateful to him for so generously giving his time and his wisdom to us on this first morning of Diwali. So please join me in virtually welcoming to the University of Southern California, Dr. Deepak Chopra.
Thank you.
Good morning, Deepak.
Thank you, Varun.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great privilege to be with you today and with all these wonderful people from USC and your ecosystem and Dr. Gold Very honored to be with you. And I would like to spend the next 30 minutes sharing with you where I think we are in understanding the future of well-being. So let me start simply by saying that we are in a moment of crisis in the world right now. And to deny that would be to be asleep. As we look across the landscape of human experience right now in the midst of this COVID-19, as a physician, I can only say I'm seeing grief across the whole landscape of human experience. And as a physician, I have witnessed grief sometimes in a very short span of time when somebody is going through the throes of a heart attack, for example. And so first there's denial, and then there is a feeling of being victimized, and then there's anger, resentment, grievances, even hostility, helplessness, and only some people find acceptance. And there is no choice, actually, if you think about it. We have to find acceptance to what is right now. And if you find acceptance, then there's the possibility of finding meaning. What is the meaning of what is happening right now? So I go back to my childhood and memories of childhood, reading the great wisdom of sages and poets like Rabindranath Tagore, one of my mentors. And Tagore said that I exist is a perpetual surprise. That I exist is a perpetual surprise. And then, somewhere else he added that if you're not perpetually surprised by your existence, then your humanity is incomplete. So I would plead with everyone right now that the way to start this discussion and envision a future is to, first of all, accept what is, number one. Secondly, to find the meaning of what is right now. Because if you don't, I think, and I may be wrong, but I think humanity is sleepwalking its way to extinction, to collective suicide. Why do I say this? I just look across the landscape of human experience and suffering right now. We have social injustice, we have economic injustice, we have extinction of species, we have mechanized ways of killing ourselves and each other, from atomic bombs to cyber warfare to biological warfare. We have poison in our food chain. We have destroyed the microbiome, which is the genetic information of this planet, which gives rise ultimately to the biosphere. And if you put all these things together, and I have a handheld device in my hand, which has more computing power today than the mainframe computer housed at MIT that sent men to the moon. This has more computing power. If you're smart enough, and any high school kid is smart enough to manipulate this, you could cut off electricity in a city, you could poison the food chain, you could interfere with pacemakers and respirators, and God forbid, you could cause a nuclear plant to leak. And I can go on and on. So I don't want to give ideas for destruction, but the last extinction was 65 million years ago when a meteorite fell on planet Earth, and the explosion that resulted was the equivalent of an atomic bomb. And the dominant species on this planet was wiped out. Dinosaurs, the dominant species on this planet was wiped out in 1 hour. Today, we have the capacity to do that 100 times over. So if we don't wake up, this is my message today on Diwali, because Diwali is the festival of lights. But what is light? We're talking about the light of awareness. If we do not wake up to the light of awareness and admit that we are heading in the direction of collective suicide, then we are sleepwalking. And this dominant species will also get wiped out. Okay, and nature will say the human species was an interesting experiment, did not work. Let's move on. If insects disappeared from our planet today, all life would cease in 5 years. This is a biological fact, ecological fact. If humans disappeared from our planet today, life would flourish in 5 years. So at this moment, we need to think about life, sentience, being. Who are we? What do we want? What is our calling at this moment? And how can we be the change we want to see in the world? Given that, I want to give you a brief glimpse into where we are in the understanding of what we call body, mind, and consciousness. So, right now, the dominant scientific paradigm says that matter, or what we call physical reality, is the ontological primitive of the universe, except no one can define what matter is. As we explain, go deep into the nature of matter, we end up with subatomic particles that also happen to be wavicles in the field of possibilities. And actually, no scientist has ever documented the existence of a substance that can be called matter. So what I'm going to present to you today, and I know we have limited time, but it doesn't matter, is a new paradigm which says the ontological primitive of the universe is not physical matter. The ontological primitive of the universe is pure consciousness. Pure consciousness as a field of infinite possibilities, as a field of unpredictability, as a field of creativity, as a field of the source of all experience, source of all perception, source of all cognition, and the source of attention and intention. If we take that as the ontological primitive, then we have an entirely new future for humanity. I believe that if we wake up collectively, reach a critical mass, then we have the hope for a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier, and joyful world. So given that, I'd like to share with you the first slide here. And what you will see on this first slide is a cover issue of the New Scientist. And this cover issue of the New Scientist gives a picture of a yogini. And the title of the cover story is Your Thinking Body. So this is a revolution that I participated in the 80s when we discovered the molecules of emotion in the brain, which everybody knows now are serotonin, opiates, dopamine, oxytocin, anandamide, and all of those which became later known as immunomodulators, etc., etc. And so in the 1980s, 88, I wrote a book called Quantum Healing, which was vilified by the medical establishment, because I proposed over there that your body is thinking, not just your brain. The brain thinks in English with an Indian accent, but actually the body itself is a biological organism that has impulses of intelligence that are very similar to what we call thought. And our body is constantly regulating itself, what we call homeostasis, when we settle into awareness without constructs. And, the subtitle of this cover issue is a little misleading. It says, why consciousness is not all in the whatever, but it's wrong. The subtitle of this cover issue is wrong. Consciousness is the fundamental principle which modifies itself into the experience that we call mind, body, and universe. The word health comes from the word holy. The word holy comes from the word whole. And so we are these days talking about alternative and complementary and integrative medicine. We should actually be talking about whole health, because health is by definition a memory to the return of wholeness. When we are whole, then we are holy and we are healed. And that is exactly what healing means. Healing is the return of the memory of wholeness, which means mind, body, perception, cognition, and the experience of the world are one unified phenomenon in consciousness. So with that, let's go to the next slide, which shows what I call the 7 pillars of well-being. And the reason that I call these the 7 pillars of well-being is that recent science has shown, and I'm now quoting one of my colleagues with whom I've written 3 books, Dr. Rudy Tanzi, who's the head of genetics at Harvard Medical School, or at Mass General and Harvard University. And Rudy informed me about 5-6 years ago that only 5% of disease-related gene mutations are fully penetrant, in that they guarantee the disease. A gene mutation is a genetic mistake. Think of genes as words. Think of DNA as the alphabet of life, and only 4 letters in the alphabet of life: A, T, C, G, adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine. But these 4 letters spell themselves into innumerable words, which we call genes, and genes interact with each other to create the story that we call life, sentience, being. And if we look at the data today, only 5% of genetic mistakes actually guarantee disease, which means if somebody has a gene, for example, like a BRCA gene that Angelina Jolie had, then she was predicted to have breast cancer. So she had what we call preventive mastectomy. Now, as we speak, and you know, the Nobel Prize this year in biology and medicine went to someone for gene editing, CRISPR. So in a few years, we'll have gene editing for situations like that. But even with that knowledge, we now know that 95% of chronic illness is actually preventable, predictable, and participatory, and personalized, and process-oriented. These are my 5 Ps for the future of well-being: personalized, predictable, participatory, preventable, and process-oriented. So 95% of chronic illness can be mitigated or prevented through the 7 pillars of well-being here: sleep, meditation and stress management, movement, yoga, pranayam, emotions, emotional resiliency, emotional intelligence, nutrition, biological rhythms, but ultimately self-awareness. So there is a lot of data to support what I'm saying here right now. And we have covered this data through our foundation in collaboration with many institutions, including UCSF and over here, Scripps and Harvard and many other institutions, where we can document very clearly that these 7 pillars of well-being can not only mitigate, but prevent and even reverse many chronic illnesses. So let's go into each of them very briefly. Sleep is the way we remove toxins from the body, physical toxins like amyloid, but also mental toxins that build up in what the yogic traditions call the subtle body of mind, intellect, and ego. And sleep deprivation is considered the #1 risk factor today from sudden death and cardiovascular disease. And so sleep deprivation is in fact a bigger risk factor than smoking or anything else. And I want everybody to know that sleep takes us to pure consciousness as well, in the same way as meditation. Restful sleep is what we access pure consciousness with, and we can also access pure consciousness through meditative practices when we are not restfully asleep, but we are restfully alert. The second pillar of well-being over here that we mentioned is stress management and all ways of activating what we call the parasympathetic nervous system. Today, the world is dominated by what is called sympathetic overdrive, the fight-flight response or the ego response. The fight-flight response, in a dangerous situation, we either fight or we run. And if that doesn't help, we try and manipulate the situation by being nice and nasty or stubborn or playing the victim. These are manipulative responses that come from addiction to security, addiction to sensation, and addiction to power. When we let go of these addictions, we realize that the addiction to security is the biggest cause of insecurity, that the addiction to power is self-destructive, that the addiction to sensation leads to all kinds of other addictions as well. When we let go of these addictions, we wake up centers of awareness in our body that have to do with what you and I would call the higher chakras, the center of awareness that we call the heart, where we experience love, compassion, joy, equanimity, the center of creative expression, the center of insight, intuition, imagination, higher consciousness, vision, going beyond, transcendence. So as we wake up through meditation and movement and pranayama, and through the emotions of love, compassion, joy, and equanimity, and change the microbial information in our body through healthy, diverse plant-based diets, we actually change 99% of the genetic information in our body. And the 1% that is human, we can upgrade through these practices as well. And finally, there's a role for biological rhythms, because as you know, in the wisdom traditions of the Vedanta, there's a word called rhythm or rita, which means there is order in the universe. And we call the universe, give the name universe to one song, to one symphony. And when our biological processes are in harmony with universal rhythms, circadian rhythms, seasonal rhythms, this is the value of these rituals, Diwali, etc. When our biological rhythms are in harmony with universal rhythms, seasonal rhythms, circadian rhythms, gravitational rhythms, lunar rhythms, then we are holy and we are healed. But this is not the total story. I have left the last pillar of well-being, self-awareness, here for a moment. As we move to the next slide, which I want to show you, that comes from my work at Gallup, where it says that total well-being is not just physical well-being, but also involves what we call corporate well-being, well-being in the workplace, social and emotional well-being, community well-being, and financial well-being. They're all entangled to our personal well-being. So if you have a joyful, energetic body, a loving, compassionate heart, a reflective, clear mind, and lightness of being, you have access to all these different subsets of well-being, which we call total well-being. Corporate well-being, business well-being, community well-being, financial well-being, they're all entangled in the deeper reality that we call consciousness. And there are ways now to measure this. So, the fact that everything is measurable is very delightful. I'm wearing many sensors right now on my body, but actually the best sensor is the body itself. The best sensor is the body itself. If you tune in to sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts, and you self-regulate them, then these sensors can only give you the metrics of what is already happening in your body when you get in touch with your deeper self. Let me show you a little bit of data. So next slide shows you what we saw when we did a one-week retreat at the Chopra Center. And this was a collaborative study with UCSF, the Chopra Foundation, Harvard, UC San Diego, etc. But what we saw in 1 week of a meditation retreat was a change in gene expression. So all the genes that were connected to self-regulation, healing, or homeostasis went up, some 17-fold. All the genes that were associated with inflammation and chronic disease like Alzheimer's, heart disease, cancer, etc., went down significantly. There's no drug that does that. And in fact, this study now has been replicated by many others with similar results. If you go to the next slide, you'll see something very remarkable. And that is in 1 week of this meditation retreat, we saw an increase in telomerase, the enzyme telomerase, by 40%. This study was done in collaboration with Elizabeth Blackburn, a Nobel laureate in medicine and biology from University of California, San Francisco. And there's, again, no drug that can do this. Elizabeth was so impressed by the study, maybe see the next slide, that she actually wrote a book called The Telomere Effect. In other words, meditation changes your biological genetic clock for aging. There's no study, there's no drug that can do that. Of course, one of our investigators said he's going to look for the IPs around this and create drugs out of it too. That's where we are. So next slide, please. You'll see what epigenetics is. This is the new science, which says basically that every experience we have, it doesn't matter what the experience, every sensation, image, feeling, thought, emotion, idea, imagination, all affects gene activity. Those blue balls that you see, that are proteins called histones, and you see DNA wrapped around these. And actually, your genes are modified moment to moment through experience. So right now, as we're speaking, and people are listening to us and absorbing this information, genes in their brain are being activated in their cerebral cortex so that they can actually engage in this understanding of what is happening. So no longer do we believe in genetic determinism, except for the 5%. It could be karmic, I don't know. But the others are modifiable. 95% of our genetic activity is modifiable through experience, through the choices we make. And that is a big deal. So with that, if you saw the next slide, we have engaged on what we call studies on self-directed biological transformation. How you can direct your biology from engaging with your own self. And one of the things that we also found in these studies, and these are published studies in peer-reviewed journals, is that people have a change in identity from me to we to the universal I, moving in the direction of non-duality. And as they have these experiences, everything shifts. The way they perceive the world, the way they think about the world, the way they behave in the world, everything shifts very drastically when we practice these practices. We can actually not only shift in identity from me to we to the universal I, but how that changes our perceptual and cognitive processes, which actually shifts what we call biological activity in our body. So if you see the next slide, you'll also see over here a change in sense of non-dual awareness and spiritual awakening with practices of total meditation, whether they're self-inquiry or self-reflection or vipassana or transcendence or mantra practice. All these techniques actually cause a shift in a sense of identity in the direction of non-dual awareness and spiritual awakening as well. So with that, I would like to share the next slide, if you can, and which shows that the effects of these practices are instantly measurable through modern technology. And this gives a lot of solace to people who ask themselves, am I doing meditation correctly or incorrectly? In fact, there is no such thing as correct or incorrect meditation. All you have to do is take the time to rest in being. And when you take the time to rest in being, you can see instant changes in your biology, in neuroplasticity, in genetic activity. So let me share with you the next slide over here, which is what we are currently doing. We're creating new algorithms and adding new biometrics, correlating everything that happens in the mind, in the body, in the emotions, and in consciousness. So take that and move to the next slide. This is how the yogi perceives their body. The body is connected to all that exists. You are familiar with the expression yatha pinde tatha brahmande. As is the atom, so is the universe. As is the human body, so is the cosmic body. As is the human mind, so is the cosmic mind. As is human consciousness, so is ultimate consciousness. And so now we are creating new biometrics and algorithms correlating emotional, mental, and physical well-being. And this is indeed becoming the current conversation in science. If you see the next slide, you'll see the new emerging paradigms that question whether evolution is random or guided by consciousness. You see the new paradigm that asks, is the universe consciousness? And you see actually the current conversation on the flaw at the heart of reality, which is we think reality is physical, but actually reality is spiritual, and physical is an interpretation of sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts that are modified forms of the self. Given that, I want to just show you the last couple of slides, and please go on to the next slide, which basically is a photo that you see. Do you see the next slide? Yeah. Now here, I want to just make a point. What you see there is two possibilities. You see an old man with a beard. Yes. You also see a man riding a horse. But it's the same combination of colors. The same combination of colors. What is entangled here is meaning. By giving meaning to experience, which is sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts, we construct our everyday experience of reality. The next slide is the same. You can see similar. So you can see a woman's face with beautiful hair, or you can see two horses in the backdrop of a mountain and sky. Which one is it? It is the meaning that you give to these colors and shapes that creates experience. And then experience gets metabolized as what we call the reality of the physical body and the physical world. So I will actually not show the remaining slides because I think we are running out of time. What I want to just say is today is an opportunity to find meaning. What is happening in the world? And if we find meaning, then there are creative possibilities. And we have all the technologies in the world right now to help us accelerate in the direction of a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier, and joyful world. From everything from epigenetics to neuroplasticity to understanding the microbiome of life to deep learning, artificial intelligence, biofeedback, bioregulation, augmented reality, mathematics, and philosophy, religion, and spirituality and science coming together. What we're seeing is emergence, I hope. And emergence happens when there's shared vision, maximum diversity of education, ethnicity, race, and spiritual heritage, maximum diversity, shared vision, emotional and spiritual bonding, and the best of technology, we indeed can create that critical mass for a more peaceful, just, sustainable, and healthier world. Otherwise, we can stop, go to the bar, get drunk, and celebrate collective suicide. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chopra, for those brilliant, inspiring, urgent words. I know it's going to open up a very rich conversation as we move forward in our keynote presentation. For those of you who have tuned in, please feel free to submit your questions to both Dr. Chopra and Dr. Miller through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And so now we're going to move on to the second part of our keynote presentation. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to introduce our next inspiring and amazing keynote speaker, Dr. Lisa Miller, whose New York Times best-selling book, The Spiritual Child, The New Science of Parenting for Health and Lifelong Thriving, changed my life and the life of my daughter. It's really one of the most important books I've ever read. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's another great gift for your loved ones, and especially for new parents. Dr. Miller is professor of psychology and education and director of the clinical psychology program at Columbia University Teachers College. She is also the founder of the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute, which is the first Ivy League graduate program in spirituality and psychology. Her research has been published in journals including JAMA Psychiatry, American Journal of Psychiatry, and the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. Dr. Miller is the editor of the Oxford Handbook of Psychology and Spirituality and co-editor of the APA journal Spirituality and Clinical Practice. She has been elected as fellow by the American Psychological Association, as well as for the Virginia Sexton Mentoring Award of graduate students. She's appeared on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and Weekend Today as an expert. I greatly appreciate her generosity of time and insight this morning. And I have to say that her work has fundamentally shaped the way we do chaplaincy at the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life at USC, where we oversee almost 100 student religious groups and 50 campus chaplains. And so her research has real impact in significant ways on our campus. And so all that being said, please join me in giving a very warm virtual welcome to Dr. Lisa Miller.
Dean Soni, thank you for your beautiful introduction. Dr. Gold, thank you for your leadership in this important event. Dr. Chopra, it is such an honor to share today with you. And indeed, you were the one who was the path breaker. You were the one that made all this possible. So it's really a joy to have the opportunity to visit with one of my true heroes. I'm coming to you as a clinical scientist and also a clinical psychologist of 20 years, a professor at Columbia University. I'm also a parent of 3 children who are now teens. The work that's going on today, coming from all different sides of healing, medicine, renewal, is enormously important in preparing us for what I see is our exit from our surprise, our unsolicited, our unchosen retreat. The whole world's been on a retreat, and if we were to liken it by way of analogy to a labyrinth, I'd say we're a few steps in from the middle. And as we know, when we exit the labyrinth, we need to prepare for how we're going to go back into the world. If the retreat ended tomorrow, I'm not sure we'd be ready, but I think together we can be. I might add only that when we come together across disciplines, there's many languages, there's many epistemologies, there's many ways of knowing, as Dr. Chopra has shared so beautifully. I'm sharing today through the language of science and perhaps in tandem, phenomenologically, the language of direct experience. So if we might open the first slide. Well, I will share with you, I started the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute about 15 years ago at Columbia University. And the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute serves to generate science and to use science as a blueprint to help create a more spiritually supportive society. So we work in basic science alongside our collaborators. We work with Columbia Medical School, Yale Medical School on neural correlates of spiritual awareness, on lifetime clinical course studies of the implications of spiritual life, on other pathways to healing and wellness. And we use science as a blueprint to help transform organizations and systems. Our Spirituality Mind-Body Institute works together with the Department of Health and Human Services to help develop more spiritually supportive systems for the severely mentally ill. I work with the U.S. Army, as well as businesses, higher education, and K-12 schools. Every one of us is a spiritual being. There's no place that we go, there's no place that we convene that can afford to be silent on our deep and foundational spiritual nature. Spirituality, by way of analogy, is command control. It is the highest superordinate of our awareness from which all other lines of action and thought follow. So if we might go now to the slides. I'm sorry, I can't quite see that. So I'll speak only of the science, which says no, scientists wouldn't dare try to define spiritual life. Scientists are not theologians, but we are keen observers. And the science that has been generated in the past 20 years has brought a lens, if you will. We can bring a telescope, we can bring a microscope, and we most certainly can bring the lens of science to any question. It's up to scientists to think, to ask. The paucity of research prior to the past 20 years is probably due to the vogues in science, which really turned their head away from spiritual life and its implications. But science is a very good method if scientists think to ask questions about spiritual life. When we look at data collected on scientists, about 70% say that, yes, logic, empiricism is the rollout, the method is driven by right off the shelf, standard, rigorous empiricism and logic. But the question that's asked in the first place is very often brought through inspiration. And as I said, over 70% of scientists say the most important question I've ever asked in my scientific career came to me through a dream, through imagination, through a synchronicity, some alignment, some what many say would be a divinely inspired or sparked by the consciousness field of life. So scientists do not only think in terms of logical empiricism. Good scientists draw on many forms of knowing. And as scientists do not define spiritual life, we bring our lens to it now, and we can look at the implications of spiritual life on all other lines of health and wellness. To frame this, in the United States, if I might invite you to envision an overlapping Venn diagram, about 2/3 of people say I am spiritual and I am religious. My deep spiritual life is held in my traditions, my prayers, my values and community of my faith. About 30% of millennials and fewer with each older generation say I am spiritual, but I am not religious. My felt sense of transcendence, love is held in my family, nature. And a small number of people will say, I'm very devoutly religious and my texts hold my values in my life, but I don't know what you mean by this spirituality thing. The bottom line, if we might have the next slide, please, is that no matter what tradition we may be from, or if we are from outside of any tradition at all, every single one of us has a deep spiritual core. Next slide, please. A deep capacity with which we are born. If we look at twin studies, twins raised together, twins raised apart, and factor out the degree of commonality as a function of shared genes and environment, we see that just about any trait, any form of human capacity can be identified as being part heritable, innate, part socialized, environmental. So temperament is about half and half. IQ is about 60% heritable, 40% cultivated. The capacity through which we experience spiritual life is 1/3 heritable, 2/3 formed, socialized. This means that every single one of us on earth is an innately spiritual being. Every single one of us. So whether we consider ourselves religious or not, spiritual or not, we are all born with the docking station, if you will, the biological home for spiritual life. 2/3 formed by environment means that how we treat each other, and in particular how we treat people in the first 20 years of life, has a profound impact on the formation of our spiritual core. When is this most sensitive? When are the developmental opportunities? Well, certainly in the first 2 decades of life, many and most of our faculties are profoundly impacted by environment. But even within those 2 decades, there's windows of particular acceleration and sensitivity. If we look at longitudinal twin studies, we see that going through middle adolescence to emerging adulthood, there's a surge, a biological clock, if you will, goes off, marked by a 50% increase in the heritable contribution to our innate spiritual life, which means that ready or not, whether or not we planned on it, there is a hunger for transcendence, a questing to understand the nature of reality. Who am I? Who are you? What is the nature of the universe? And does God exist? Does consciousness exist? How is this all made? This comes upon us whether or not we've had a guide or a mentor. But every tradition on earth, whether we speak of the sweat lodge, bar and bat mitzvah, confirmation, has known that biological puberty is a time of spiritual awakening. When we rise up, 2/3 environmentally formed, when we as parents, teachers, faith communities, anyone who touches the adolescent or emerging adult is having an impact on the formation of the spiritual core. If this is indeed supported, we now know through about 2 decades of good science, good peer-reviewed science, that there's nothing in the clinical or social sciences as profoundly protective against the most prevalent forms of suffering. If we might have the next slide. A teen 1 standard deviation above as compared to below the mean, and a tendency to say, my personal spirituality is highly important to me. Amongst theistic samples, I turn to God for guidance in times of difficulty. When I have a tough decision to make, I ask, what really does God want me to do? Nature is a sacred home to me. I feel a sense of oneness with all life. That teen who says that clearly and strongly, a standard deviation above the mean, as compared to a teen, a standard deviation below the mean, who says, I don't really know what you're talking about. That teen is 80% less likely to become addicted to substances, going through the window of risk, which is mid-late adolescence into emerging adulthood. 60% less likely to have major depressive disorder. Every teen gets depressed, but why, in this case, do we see a protective benefit against episodes of MDD? Ken Kendler and his colleagues found that each time I trip under the rain cloud of suffering, each time I have a minor depression, I develop a way of thinking. And with each episode of depression, I develop a depressogenic way of thinking. I'm such a loser. Things always happen to me. Life isn't fair. And a depressogenic way of thinking makes it easier the next time to get depressed again. And this starts right there in middle adolescence. However, if we can be there, 2/3 socialized, to build a spiritual response to suffering, then by way of analogy, we strengthen the muscle. And the teen develops a way of saying, one door closes, another opens. I just know that life is foundationally good. I'm being buoyed up. If I hadn't had this loss, I never would have met you. There's another way of being and thinking into life, a spiritual response to suffering. And so too, a teen, a standard deviation above as compared to below the mean, and a strong personal spirituality within or without of a religious tradition is far less likely to engage in risk-taking and far less vulnerable to suicidality. In The Spiritual Child, I chronicle much of this science. Next slide, please. And you can turn to the back and find all the references of the primary sources. Now, as many of you in this moment know, science is a very collaborative field. Any article published, particularly in a rigorous journal, has been read by at least 2 or 3 scientists, at least 2 or 3 times. So when peer review produces a scientific article, it says, we, the field, think this method is clean. The findings state what the article says they say. Peer review science is a beautiful way that a field can ensure the closest thing we have through the method of science to fact. So in the back of The Spiritual Child, you will see the articles which you can identify on PsycInfo, Medline, and read yourself. I'm going to speak in aggregate. If we might have the next slide, please. A spiritual response to suffering. These broad and pervasive regions that you see in red are regions of cortical thickness in the parietal, precuneus, and occipital regions. The cortex, perhaps by way of analogy, is processing power. And there's thick, lush trees you might envision of thick cortex in these regions of perception and reflection in people with a sustained spiritual life. We published this in JAMA Psychiatry in 2014. And what is particularly remarkable is that in these broad regions, there is about 85% overlap, not cortical thickness, but cortical thinness in people with recurrent major depression, offering suggestion that sustained spiritual life may be neuroprotective against major depressive disorder. Remember, a spiritual response to suffering. There is, as Dr. Chopra pointed out, in every choice and every way of being, we are building and rebuilding ourselves. And the lens through which I see life, I can live on the same cul-de-sac, in the same house, with the same family and the same pals, and it all looks entirely different if I look through the lens of the red brain, the spiritually supported brain. Next slide. So that brings us to our moment. Might the 52 card pickup, might the total unearthing under our feet of the world as we know it be a trauma that's a doorway to illumination, a doorway to a deepening of spiritual life, a deepening of our capacity to see through the red brain, if you will. I was very moved in the introduction by Dean Soni, and again, as mentioned by Dr. Chopra, that in Diwali, the Festival of Light, there is the opportunity for vision, renewal. I find it remarkable, and with such awe, I note that we are a month from the darkest point of the year. We kindle our light in our darkest hour. We are a month from the winter solstice. And so next slide, please. This is who we are. Through the eyes of scientists, this is the most beautiful testimony to who we are. The inverted U-shaped curve, the umbrella curve. Along the x-axis are symptoms of trauma, suffering, the 52-card pickup. Remember, trauma just isn't anxiety and loss. It is unearthing of the world as I knew it. And up the X, across the x-axis, symptoms of trauma. Up the y-axis are units of growth. And here we see the portrait of who we are as human beings. Post-traumatic growth is in our nature. The lion's share of us in the middle, a standard deviation on either side of the mean, and these folks all had trauma. This is a sample of 3,000 vets, first author TSAI 2018. Those of us in the middle who've had meaningful levels of trauma have also had meaningful levels through that very trauma of post-traumatic growth. The folks on the left have had less trauma and less growth, and the folks on the right have perhaps been flooded so that they need ever more our support. But it is our very nature that through the doorway of trauma, through loss and suffering and an unearthing, comes a new light if we guide each other, and if we turn to our deep inner spirituality, our connection with the sacred, the transcendent, the loving, guiding consciousness field, whatever words may be ours. Next slide, please. So I will say that although I can't read this slide, I know these studies well, which is 75% of vets, and this is from the PSI study, who had PTSD, clinical PTSD, also reported substantial post-traumatic growth. And it is also the case that if we distill what traits are strong predictors of post-traumatic growth, it is first and foremost the spiritual core, a strong personal spirituality a priori. When I work with people from faith communities, they often say, build your ark before it rains. When I work with the U.S. Army, we talk about preparedness, fitness, and readiness. Preparedness, fitness, and readiness for the spiritually fit soldier. And when I work with higher education, we talk about the window of awakening and the essential call for spiritual formation. This can happen before trauma, and it can happen during trauma. And this now is our opportunity to support one another, and particularly emerging adults and young people in the formation of their deep spiritual awareness, the red brain, a spiritual response to suffering. Next slide, please. Okay, I truly cannot see that, but I think we're up to suicidality, which is the tragic outcome of trauma unsupported. In speaking for now 3 or 4 years on the road with the spiritual child, I am often called to places like Rye, New York, and Palo Alto, where there are clusters of suicides. And I will say that my own campus of Columbia University a couple years ago had 9 publicly acknowledged suicides. So this is the epidemic of our time. As many of you may know in this Zoom, the rate of death by suicide in high school now rivals that by death in auto accidents. And so too, in the past 2 years, in middle school. So if we tell a young person, 13 through 19, to buckle up before you get in a car and fly down the highway, we must prepare them by building the spiritual core. We must give them this foundational seed of resilience, knowing that their risk for death by suicide rivals that of death by auto accidents. The best meta-analysis that I have seen is by Wu and colleagues, 2015, and Wu did effectively a study of studies. We might call it a meta-analysis is when you pool all good studies that meet certain criteria and you say, all told, everybody in. What are the protective benefits of spiritual life against completed suicide? And in a study of 2,000 tragically completed suicides and over 5,000 matched controls in this meta-analysis, Woon colleagues found there was a 62% decreased relative risk. I am 62% less likely to suffer completed suicide if I have a strong personal spirituality or religion. And if that is shared, then I am 82% less likely. There is nothing in the clinical sciences at all that is 4/5 protective against a completed suicide. And if you told me that my kids could take a supplement or a pill or go to a special place and do a special exercise to prevent against completed suicide, there would be a line, around the CVS or Walgreens. This is a statement not of how to enact treatment, but more foundationally of who we really are and how we must realize our core spiritual nature in order to survive and thrive. Next slide, please. These are the studies. Next slide, please. Now, how are we handling our epidemic of depression? How are we handling our epidemic of diseases of despair, right? The addictions and the more steady, destructive, low-grade binge drinking and unhealthy living. Well, as many of you know, there is a mass overprescription of SSRIs. Right? And in a beautiful study done in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry, it was shown that over half the people who currently be prescribed SSRIs do not meet a diagnosis of depression, and over 35% meet no psychiatric diagnosis at all. This is the jumpstart of happiness. This is a psychopharmacological response to despair. What's one way of tracking this? Well, we looked at people to recover from depression through a deepening of spiritual life. And what we found was that those who recover from MDD, diagnosis of MDD through a deepening of spiritual life, this is Tanky, I'm in there, Weissman's in there, 2013, biological psychiatry. Those who recover through a deepening of spiritual life give off posterior alpha when you put an EEG get-up on their head. Okay, think back to the red brain. The parietal's back here as well. This is where the yarmulke goes. It's where many faith traditions cover the head. My husband's pleased to point out that it's where the baseball cap goes. So this region back here gives off posterior alpha. Well, there's another way that we can see a jump start, an increase in posterior alpha, and that's if we recover through MDD through SSRIs, such as Prozac. So it is entirely possible that we are jump starting a felt sense of spirituality, but as we know well, when you take away the SSRIs, the whole thing goes away. And there is a very large number of people who don't respond to SSRIs. So my claim is not that all depressions are spiritual despair, but that much of despair that is diagnosed as depression is actually a hunger for spiritual emergence, a developmental depression through which spirituality needs to be realized, a spiritual response to suffering. Next slide. When we engage in a deep spiritual awareness, we give off alpha, and alpha is again the sign of recovery. Alpha has another name. Alpha is Schumann's resonance. It's the wavelength from the Earth's crust up 1 mile. It is the wavelength of nature here on Earth. So the spiritually engaged brain vibrates at the same wavelength as life, as creation. And I think someday my grandkids will really laugh till their sides ache that grandma measured sacred awareness. Grandma measured the consciousness of all life, the consciousness field in and through all life with an EEG machine. And finally, I think, how are we doing on time? I think I might be running out of time. I'll just 5 minutes. Good. Okay. Having looked at spiritual life as foundational to who we are, as essential to flourishing, as a form of hunger and necessary form of development, with left willy-nilly, left to atrophy, devolves into depression. and downward spiral. Let's look now at the upside. Next slide, please. We know that if you set up the spiritual core, by the time I graduate from high school, 18, 19, with 90% stability, it is there as I go through the ensuing decades of life. There's a profound formative window in late adolescence, emerging adulthood. And at the same time, so-called sophomore slump needs to be regarded as the opportunity of a lifetime to form the spiritual core. It is not surprising that in the beautifully constructed family, right as my teenage children have developmental depression, I too am likely to hit the wall in what we have called midlife crisis. Midlife crisis is Act 2. It's, as Jung talked about, a dark night of the soul. So many have talked about midlife as a time of deepening. And in fact, our recent studies show that those who are most spiritually inclined have the most painful existential dive at midlife. Midlife is a time of adult development, a passage through the door once again. But if we can develop the spiritual core 1820 and revisit and deepen even more in midlife, we are on a path which is an adult trajectory of a foundationally spiritual life, a life viewed with much more love, much more connection. And we live in the realm of both linearity and non-linearity. As I say to my students, we are both a point and a wave. We are able to toggle between the levels of awareness that create a life that is both unified and loving, where we make decisions that help us and others, where that's what is good for me is also good for you, and effectiveness. So let's look finally at the upside of life. These are the next slide, character strengths and virtues. They get so much play. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. Grit, determination, optimism. And if I might invite you to think of a young person, an adult, someone you know with tons of grit, and now someone with tremendous optimism, and now someone full of commitment. How many people were you thinking of? The modal response is one. And that is because, next slide, please, the character strengths and virtues do not sort independently amongst us. They cluster in the same people. This is a sample of 6,000 college students. And you'll see that for some people, those represented way up high in blue, there's lots of grit and tons of optimism, and they're very forgiving. The character strengths and virtues might best be understood as a singular entity of character strength, virtue. And those in red, who we as healers love just as much, are low in everything and have a rough road. Green is in the middle. You're looking at effectively parallel lines. For 85% of college students, and it goes to about 75% of adults, the character strengths and virtues are a singular entity anchored in the far left in daily spiritual awareness. I am as forgiving and as persistent and as optimistic as I am daily living on spiritual bedrock. I see nature as a spiritual home. I live in dialogue with a loving, guiding God, universe, consciousness field, Allah, Hashem, whatever my words may be. I use my red brain. I am home. I'm in the seat of awareness, the perceptual seat of living every day on sacred bedrock and walking in dialogue with this loving consciousness field or unit of being. So next slide. Here's the hard work of adolescence. It's on page 246 of The Spiritual Child. There's a head at a well-known New York school who tore page 246 out. I would have Xeroxed it for him. And this is why the hard work of growing up unfolds entirely differently if we support the spiritual core of the teen. Remember, 2/3 socialized. Everything you do matters. Next slide, please. And finally, I want to talk about the fact how if we use the circuit of spiritual awareness in our brain, life looks different. Remember, same cul-de-sac, different decision-making, different life. I have 2 minutes. Together with my colleagues at Yale Medical School, we invited 18 through 22-year-olds, many of them students, not all, into our lab. And they told us of a time they were stressed, and they told us of a time where they were just chill, and then finally where they felt a deep sense of connection to their higher power, to God, Allah, Hashem, the universe, nature. Well, when we told from our young adults the story of stress, what lit up in the fMRI was the insulin striatum. And my colleague in addiction said, yeah, I know that. Stress, as we're looking at it in our young, capable adults, is the addicted brain. And the narrative did not sound like, oh, this is so challenging, or oh, this is so hard. Stress sounded like, I've got to have it. I've got to have that job at Morgan Stanley. I've got to get into USC medical school. I've got to. And that habit trail of life was an addiction. It doesn't matter what this rotation I caught, because the wheel kept spinning. But if that very same young person is invited, hey, let's put our hand on the gear and shift into your deep set of spiritual awareness. What we saw was goodbye insulin striatum, and what came on were regions of deep unitive awareness, regions of love, and a much broader and perceptive field of awareness. So we'll go to the very last slide. And I just want to share with you that this is our choice at every moment. We can run the habit trail, I've got to have it, or we can put our finger on the gear shift into our deep spiritual frame of being. Spirituality is not necessarily a belief or a cognition. It is a deep seat of being, a docking station, if you will, with which we are hardwired, but can develop to join in a loving, guiding, unitive reality. This is ours, this is our choice, and who we are to one another determines if we get there together as a collective. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lisa Miller. I mean, so much of what you said resonates with what we see on our university campus, especially with the rise of anxiety and depression, suicidal ideation. Really, over the last 10 years, it's almost a generational shift between millennials and post-millennials. So it really hit close to home for us, and I really appreciate your wisdom and insight. And now we get to move into our fireside chat opportunity or conversation. I have questions for both Deepak and Lisa, and then I'll also ask questions to both of them. I encourage everyone to ask questions on chat. I know that some of you already have. Some of you have asked for the slides. This keynote will go online on YouTube, and so we'll make sure you have the link and have access to all that data. I want to start with Deepak with a question that really that you've talked about this for a long time, and I've been thinking about it for a long time. And it's the idea of consciousness, and really what you seem to be arguing against is this notion of Cartesian dualism, this mind-body split. It seems what you're saying is that as we imagine our health, we should really be imagining it within consciousness, that even the body is a verb, but it's a perception of consciousness. And consciousness is really the foundational block of our reality. If that is the case, then thinking about healing, and this is a conference for alternative and complementary medicine practitioners. If healing is happening in consciousness, then how do we relate to the body? What is the body? Is the body part of consciousness? Whose body is consciousness? Who is the person who's seeing whose body? Like, where is consciousness within the equation? How do we heal the body if all of our perception and healing is happening within consciousness?
Beautiful question, actually, and not an easy one to understand or even answer. But one thing is clear: dualism is out. The reason dualism is out, it violates all the laws of physics and thermodynamics. If the mind and body are two separate things, how do they interact? If I want to lift my arm up, that starts with a thought. This is a very physical activity. How does the thought, which is not material, cause this? What is the medium? What is the energetic flow? So without going into details, dualism doesn't have any scientific validity whatsoever. So understanding the body can be done on many models. The body is physical, it's a noun. Body is non-physical, it's an activity. It's a changing activity of energy, information. Those are all models, and they're useful models. If I use the body as a physical model, I treat it like I treat a physical anatomical structure. If I think of it as energy and information, I go into epigenetics and all of that. But if I realize that the only way I know what I call the body is through an intermittent stream of sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts, then who or what is having those sensations, images, and thoughts, and how do they occur? And the non-dual traditions say sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts are modifications of pure consciousness into an experience. We metabolize experience, and then we call it the body. Now, of course, in our tradition, we call it karma. Your internal dialogue right now is being experienced as your body, whether it's pain or joy or suffering.
And so from that point, Lisa, getting back to your work and what I see on our college campuses, I want to take this point as a point of departure, what Deepak said, which is that healing comes from wholeness, comes from holiness. And what I have seen is an exact sort of translation of your research, which shows that if you have an intergenerational spiritual or religious experience growing up, you are significantly less likely to suffer from anxiety or depression as a young adult. At USC and across the country, we are seeing an alarming, devastating rate of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. Depression and suicidal ideation has doubled over the last 9 years for our college students. And we see the life and death consequences of that on our campus and across our country. Even as we're going to spend $70 billion this year across higher education to protect our students from COVID in terms of their physical health, we will lose by an order of magnitude more students this year, tragically, because of suicide and accidental drug overdoses than we will because of COVID. And even post-COVID, those mental, emotional, and spiritual health challenges will endure. So here's the challenge I see, Lisa, is that even as I see my young adults on my campus suffering tremendously, and it gets worse and worse every year, I recognize that we're at a point where 45% of our incoming students were not formally raised with religion, compared to 20% of the American population. So this is cutting across generations, and we'll never go back to a predominantly religious society given the trends. What should I be telling my college students about a spiritual practice or a habit or perspective, especially if they've been raised without religion at the age when they come to us at 18 to 22, to help create the protective factors that they might have got had they been exposed to this as in their adolescence, but to think about it as young adults?
I'm so uplifted that at USC, you've made this a priority, and that you, Dean Soni, are in a leadership position that puts this front and center, because it actually is the epidemic of our time. And while it affects people of every decade, it is most egregiously a source of suffering in late adolescents and emerging adults. The attenuation of spiritual awareness, the lack of parental and grandparental impact. We looked at 3 generations of families, and we saw that if my parent and I are concordant, if there's an intergenerational transmission of family faith life, whatever that denomination may be, or outside a denomination, intergenerational transmission of spiritual life, I am 80% protected against onset of MDD, major depression disorder, going through the window of risk. And if the torch is passed from grandparent to parent to child, then I am 90% protected against onset of major depression going through the window of risk. Why? Because the seeds are foundational. All that we live and do as a family, how we speak to each other, how we know our friends, the guy on the subway, how we view life itself, is deeply inset in the family. As you say, over the past 4 decades, there's been a very steep decline in family religious observance and even in family spiritual life. A lot of people say I'm spiritual but not religious. Well, that can really work, but very often it doesn't get that same dedication. It doesn't have a language, a practice, a set of values, a community, the dimensions that support spiritual formation. So what we've seen is that, 25 years ago, a student might have shown up at the Columbia campus or the USC campus. And 25 years ago, whether or not my family was religious, there was a de facto spiritual life, in a religious life, in the air and water. There was some sense that even if I say I don't believe in God, I've really thought about it. And even if I say, oh, I don't pray, I was taught to pray as a child, or my best friend did. Or even if I say I've never meditated, well, I watched my father meditate. So that deep lived familiarity, where religious and spiritual life are simply part of the fabric of society, is much tethered, very much tethered. And the young person showing up in crisis, whether with suicidality or depression, more than anything, exactly as you say, Dean Soni, needs support for their spiritual core. And that can involve group work. We now do this on the Columbia campus. We are literally in the dorms and in the classrooms offering, it's a choice, optional, we call it awakened awareness groups, spiritual awareness groups, and they love it. We have them identify their higher self, their higher power. They've never been asked. And because this is our birthright, because this is a quarter inch under the surface, they love it. They grapple, but they get it. So I do think whether it's some sort of universal type practice, like we've taken a turnout at Columbia, or invite them to go with friends to different places of worship, invite them into practices right there in your wellness center, as I'm sure you already are, meditation practices, spiritual visualization. Hey, is there anything from your childhood that is at all familiar? Maybe they'll dust off a rusty prayer from their grandmother. Anything that has any traction, if I even at first feel a little awkward, deepens its roots. And we found this with whether we're talking about Columbia students or homeless young adults at Covenant House or the U.S. Army. Everyone at 18 through 24 needs support for the spiritual core. It has nothing to do with SES or ethnicity or anything else. Every one of us needs support for the spiritual core. That said, one last point. If we look at data, we see that kids from resourced families have particular lack of support. I coupled up with Sunil Luther, my colleague, and we found that late adolescents from high-resourced, wealthy neighborhoods had less than a quarter of the national rate of spirituality. And if they did, they were protected against the otherwise elevated rates of pathology. The way they got it was family, faith, and spiritual practice.
That's really interesting and somewhat counterintuitive, quite frankly. I would have assumed that, wrestling with existential questions in some ways is a class-based luxury, but it sounds as though, and that explains why we have such trauma in places like Palo Alto, quite frankly, because of this correlation that you're making. I have a question for both of you. It's obvious that the pandemic has caused great emotional and mental disruption. 80% of our students say that COVID has negatively impacted their mental health, and these were students who are already struggling with depression and loneliness and anxiety in really significant ways. 3 times as many Americans are more anxious this year than last year. A quarter of Americans have thought about quitting their job over the last year. So there's real economic and pain, there's real emotional pain across the world right now. But it also seems like a deep, profound moment for reflection, for renewal, for growth, for insight. Even as people are struggling, they're self-aware that they're struggling. So as you mentioned, Lisa, we teach mindfulness classes. We normally have 300 or 400 people every session. This year we had 1,200 people in our first session and 500 on the waiting list. So people are coming to new practices. 42% of students during COVID have taken on a new spiritual or emotional health practice because they're aware that they're struggling. So my question for both of you is, what are the spiritual insights, resources, perspectives, worldviews, practices that we can develop because of COVID? We know what the downside is. What's the positive? What's the upside, the upstream that we can take away, both as adults and as parents, and maybe even in the lives of our children? Maybe I'll start with you, Deepak.
Again, very complicated question, but I think of reimagining life, reimagining existence, reinventing the body, resurrecting the soul, and looking at a revision of how we rethink humanity. So what I've been doing in the last 3 months or 7 months, focusing on 2 things. One is the planetary microbiome, not just the human microbiome, planetary, which is all the genetic information under the soil. So if you go under the soil in the Amazon, you'll find more genetic biodiversity than all the surface of the rainforest, of all the planet. The gold mine of life as genetic information exists under the soil. It is responsible for plants, microbes, bacteria, fungi, animals, humans, primates. So as I see the pandemic, I also see that the ecosystem is repairing itself. Birds are singing, fish are back, etc., etc. Bees are back. And if we can resurrect this genetic information, which is the entanglement of sentience, basically, on the planet, we can actually even repair the biosphere. So that's one thing I'm thinking of. The second thing I'm thinking of is how do we take this opportunity to rethink everything from oil to oil-free energy, from food being manufactured to actually coming from the genetic microbiome, from transportation systems that are old to new systems, from materials to qubits and quanta and waves and particles and electromagnetic energy. There's a lot of areas to think about, and there are many think tanks right now that are actually coming together to reimagine humanity. So I'm seeing this as an opportunity at the moment.
And Lisa, what about you? I've spent quarantine with my 6-year-old daughter. It's been really beautiful in a lot of ways. We're closer than we've ever been. We have meals together. There's a lot of beauty and awe and joy and gratitude that happens in the midst of it. And she's more resilient than I am in many ways. But what have you seen in terms of parenting, in terms of adolescent development, pediatric spirituality in COVID that might have surprised you as potential light as opposed to darkness?
The first thing I've seen is that children are, in fact, very resilient, and children are so loving. So this idea that as we grow up, we're handed the notion that somehow if you play the right game and do the right things, your life is stable. We're indoctrinated, oftentimes implicitly, into illusions of stability and certainty. And that just got a big shattering, a 52 hard pickup. And the young child isn't attached and doesn't think that the world that they could own or control or have was damaged. They live in an immediate unit of reality. The child is inherently spiritual. And that awareness that actually what buoys us up is love. Actually, what connects us is a deep felt unity. The connective tissue in life is what holds us, not a cathexis to institutions or to money or to outward things that could have the illusion of safeness. So the young child gets that. It's a real kick in the gut for someone who has played by the rules and saw that things weren't stable. But in that sense, it's also our opportunity of a lifetime. If I were to say what in the 20th century caused more suffering than anything, it was, as Dr. Chopra pointed out, illusions of separateness, duality. And yet, when my youngest child was 4, she would wake up in the night crying, and the house was safe and it was everything. She was loved and well liked, but we had just dropped a bomb on children in another country. The child's dialed in, and there is no hard dualism. We're all one. So I think that the child is prepared to be able to toggle between being a point and being in a wave, seeing separateness and seeing unity. It's what the parietal does in our brain, that we're both one, we share a common form of being, and then you have your life and I have mine, that the child's ready for this. And if we can show up in her or his zone, we'll be able to usher them through this in a way that maintains their natural spiritual awareness.
Deepak, you in your new book, Total Meditation, you give mantras for 52 weeks, a mantra for a week for a year. And of course, mantra is an ancient Vedic science. I think literally in Sanskrit, it means an instrument for stretching the mind. Can you talk about, and you've given these in Sanskrit because there are some vibrational energies that are important in the way the mantras are pronounced and articulated, even if you don't know the meaning of the mantra. Can you talk a little bit, not about the spirituality of mantra, but of the science of mantra, why you included this in your Total Meditation book? And do we know anything from a research perspective about mantras and, say, epigenetics or neuroplasticity?
Yes, first of all, we do. Mantra, as you just pointed out, has two roots etymologically. Man means mind. It's the root of manas, mind. Human, woman, all comes from the word man. We are thinking beings. Tra, the instrument of the mind that takes you beyond the mind. Now, in our tradition, the Vedic tradition, and in Buddhist tradition, there are mantras that are called bij mantras that actually take you to the source of thought. So as you recite the mantra mentally, what happens is the upward stroke of meditation is what we call thoughts, feelings, emotions, memories, desires. It's part of our experience when we close our eyes and meditate. That's the upward stroke. The downward stroke is mantra. But once in a while, what happens is both mantra and thought disappear. That's what we call transcendence. You're in the space between thoughts, which is pure consciousness. So once you get that experience, it's an experience of wholeness. Now, of course, in our tradition and in the Buddhist tradition also, there are also other mantras which are thematic, which are named after deities. Deities are expanded awareness. That's all. When I think of Mahalakshmi, it's expanded awareness of abundance. When I think of Saraswati, it's expanded awareness of wisdom. I remember as a 4-year-old, my mother telling me, you should chase the goddess of wisdom, and then the goddess of abundance, Lakshmi, will get jealous and she'll chase you. So never go after the goddess of abundance, go after the goddess of knowledge. And, I believed her, my mother. And, my childhood was all mantras, sutras, Mahavakyas and all of that. And now I realize that the mantras not only do what they're supposed to do, but they also take you away from your internal dialogue, which is your pain body. The Buddhists call the physical body the pain body or the pleasure body. They're the same. Pleasure and pain alternate. This is the pain body. The mantra takes you away from the pain body into the direction of pure consciousness, transcendence, the religious experience, which is transcendence, emergence of platonic values, love, compassion, joy, equanimity, and the loss of the fear of death. Because consciousness being non-local and the experience of that, you don't have fear of death. Death only happens to experience, not to the source of experience.
Lisa, you're one of the things I really love about your work is that you've given us a new vocabulary to help us think about this convergence of spirituality and science. And the university is a great place to think about this. One of the terms that you use that I think is important, not just for our children, but for us, especially in an increasingly non-affiliated, religiously non-affiliated world, is the idea of spiritual multilingualism. What is spiritual multilingualism as you see it? And why is it important for us and for our children at this particular moment?
I'm so glad you raised that and highlight that. Mahzern Banaji and her team at Harvard found that by the time a child is 6, we feel that our family's name for the higher power is more real than the name used by the family down the street of a fellow faith tradition. And by the time a child is 6, we are more likely to share our peanut butter and jelly sandwich with a child in the class who uses the same name for the higher power. So this is work that needs to start immediately with the 2-year-old and continue all the way through higher education. In my class at Columbia, we have groups on the development of spiritual multilingualism, which is the ability to know in the resonance of the heart what is being said by someone of a fellow faith tradition, which means not that I nod respectfully, not that I simply am inclusive, but rather that I have a deep unitive resonance. I can feel what is being said by someone in Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Muslim words and symbols. In my class at Columbia, we do this. And one person will say, my grandmother, she died. And when she died in Africa, I was tattooed. And I am forever linked to my grandmother. And the next person will say, yes, I got that, because energy is never destroyed. It persists. So she must go on in some way. And the next person will say, well, my grandmother taught me to love God. I love God so much all day long. I feel her or his presence. And the person will say, yes, that is the continuity of consciousness. And the seamless flow between language, between symbol, between traditions allows for a deep, respectful, and if you might say the Sangha, the fellowship, the journey group, as we call it, has the opportunity to quest together, solve problems together from a seat of spiritual awareness. So what is spiritual multilingualism? It's the ability to feel a deep spiritual resonance and then express that in 3 or 4 different languages of faith traditions, or catch from someone else what is deeply being meant at the level of ontology, of reality, through their language. Most important thing we can do, because right now the public square is silent on spiritual life because we don't know how to language it. We're so worried about saying the wrong thing that the baby has been thrown out with the bathwater, and that, of course, is our hope. Our hope is that we can be spiritually conversant.
I love that. Yeah, spiritually literate. And that should be a literacy in the same way that financial literacy is a literacy, or what have you. So I'm going to move to the questions that are coming in. And this one's for Deepak. What should the role of artificial intelligence or augmented reality be, or virtual reality, towards socially beneficial applications for the individual and society? And how can emerging technologies be used as tools to push us forward as opposed to as instruments of regression? That balance between technology as a force for good or as a self-destructive force, as you talked about earlier on.
So the way I think of it, Varun, is, and thank you for that last bit from Lisa on spiritual literacy. So the way I see technology right now is that it's part of human evolution and that you cannot stop it no matter what. So it's here to stay. We are using technology right now to have this conversation, and hopefully that's benefiting people. Technology is here to stay. It's neutral. What we do with it, I gave you the examples of diabolical uses of technology in my presentation. But the divine uses of technology is to expand our awareness and actually even expand our awareness beyond the leaky margins of the fragmented human mind. I see infinite possibilities in technology. I just gave a lecture at MIT on the future of technology. Happy to send it to you. Even things like trans-species communication with other sentient beings, everything is possible once we understand that technology can be used to expand our awareness beyond the bandwidth of conditioned human fragmented mind. When we go beyond that, we will see. Of course, technology will never be sentient. It would not have sexual impulses or hunger or fear of death. It's just data, knowledge, perhaps even wisdom, but not sentience.
And Lisa, I want to move to the sort of dark side as I see it on a college campus, which is one of the things, there are 2 trends that I... Sorry.
I'm so sorry. Can I just comment on something?
Sure, please. Yes, please.
The young child starts in relationship with all life. As you know, Dr. Chopra puts so beautifully, can we return there? The young child is in relationship with fellow living beings. So by way of example, my oldest child, Isaiah, when he was a little tiny child, we went to the park and he was playing with the like age little yellow fluffy geese, the baby geese. And this is very exciting, but then suddenly the 18-month friendliness frightened Mama Goose, and she whipped around and hissed. And when she hissed, she whipped away from Isaiah to me. She knew me as a mother, and I had violated in that moment the universal law that every mama watches her child to the protection of the next child. She was in relationship with me, and I can tell you hundreds of stories of experiences like this that I've had, that many, many, many children have had. So when we say, oh, the goose wanted your breadcrumbs, or, oh, let's go look at the goose in the cage at the zoo, we're teaching them a separateness, and we're, over time, thinning out, we're attenuating their natural ability to be in relationship with all living beings. This is how we're born. I'm thrilled by Dr. Chopra's vision of helping us recapture that. And I can say at the Spirituality and Mind Body Institute, we take graduate students to rescue farms where they find that animals are not just conscious. These animals who've been rescued from being butchered and killed are actually compassionate teachers. And we see students gain insight through relationship with cows and through relationships with goats and geese that absolutely startled them, but then stay with them. So we'd have so much to learn from fellow living beings. And we're born with the ability, the rich indigenous myths say coyote does this and crow does that. We're born to be in relationship. That has been perhaps one of the greatest casualties of dualism, that we think others are different and not us simply because they're not human.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that really sort of leads us into a question from the audience for you, Lisa, which is someone has asked that my daughter has a tendency to be negative and can be affected by anxiety. She has a good therapist. I think she's a 16-year-old daughter. But this parent really wants her daughter to take up a spiritual practice like meditation. The daughter is resisting, says that this is kind of kooky and I have no reason to do this. How should parents have conversations about spiritual practice with teenagers that helps them embrace something that might be helpful for them as opposed to push it away? Sometimes I know even with my 6-year-old, if I say it, it's a reason for her not to do it as opposed to doing it, even if I think it's something that she needs to do. So what have you learned in your work?
You captured that beautifully. So as a parent, we have the opportunity to teach by being, to teach by doing. So if I might hope that my child pray, I can sit down and I can pray out loud. If I might hope that my child meditate, I sit down and meditate. I'll share a story. There was a woman I knew whose father meditated every day. And each day she would pass him. She could have walked anywhere, but she walked right by him, looked at him. He would invite her. Would you like to sit beside me? And she'd say, no, thanks, and leave. This went on for years. And yet at the end of senior year, she started to sit by him and started to meditate. When she got to college, she hit what almost every young person does, a developmental depression, the existential hunger of the booting up of our deep natural spiritual life, the existential hunger that is the half-empty glass of spirituality. As we biologically have no choice, we cannot help but deepen and hunger for spiritual life. She started to meditate. Her father had never asked her to meditate, but he'd done it himself. Our teens, despite all of the little dings and disses that we get, and despite the fact I'll never be like you and tons of jokes at our expense, are riveted by what we do. And when we live it out, they've seen it. The science says that in the making of the spiritual teen, there's an equal contribution of parental spiritual life and, the 2/3 socialized, parental spiritual life and transparency. If I sit beside my teen, this is, offering number 2, and I talk about the time that sophomore year, I didn't know if God existed, and I felt so empty and so depressed. I used to go to the basement of my dorm and wonder about existential things. But then that summer, I was walking in the forest and I came to a stream and I saw light upon the water and I just knew God existed. Or then I went home and I saw Grandma and Grandpa and their love was so true. I just felt in my inner wisdom, I had a deep knowing that the universe is good and we're loved. If we tell our story of spiritual individuation, our sophomore slump, our developmental depression, and the way through to a deepening of spiritual life, they will remember it the rest of their life. They will be riveted. And they likely won't even tell you that.
Varun, may I comment?
Yes, please.
So, some neuroscientists are talking about a phenomenon called limbic resonance and limbic revision and limbic regulation. So as Lisa knows more than I, this is the emotional brain. When a baby is looking at its mother, predominantly mother, really, in most situations. What it looks at is her eye movements, her facial expressions, her body language, and her tone of voice. That's it. Okay, that's emotional resonance. Is she caring? Is she there for me? And there are 4 things that accentuate that: attention, which means deep listening; affection, deep love and caring, unconditional; appreciation, noticing the qualities of that child; so acceptance, not trying to change that child; acceptance, appreciation, and the 4 A's that I mentioned. That induces what some scientists call limbic resonance. And then a process starts, limbic regulation. The healer and the healee regulate each other's brains, and ultimately limbic revision, the neural networks change. So love is the ultimate healer. And now we can actually show that neurologically, that there is no bigger healing than love.
Dr. Chopra, I'm so glad you say that, because parents all day long say, I didn't do enough of this. I didn't give enough positive affirmation. I wasn't structured enough. Dinner wasn't at the same time. I wonder if I really modeled being empowered as a woman. And yet, I fully agree with you. I think our deep love as parents, love conquers all.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what the Beatles told us, right? More than 50 years ago. All you need is love. Deepak, here's a question that's come in for you. As you know, this is a community that you're speaking to today of healthcare practitioners, and many physicians and first responders and emergency technicians, and also therapists and chaplains and nonprofit organizers and activists are feeling compassion fatigue right now. They're feeling burnt out because the problems of the world are so great and the pain is so intense that when we go into the trenches day by day, week by week, it's hard not to internalize the trauma that we feel. And at some point, it begins to consume us. So the question is, what do you recommend for people who are on the front line of trauma in terms of their own self-care, in terms of combating compassion fatigue and burnout in their own life, and developing a sense of resilience that allows them to continue to do this work while also nourishing and nurturing themselves?
As you know, Varun, fatigue and burnout is the biggest risk factor for healers and doctors and physicians and psychiatrists and nurses and anybody on the front line. Burnout, which means they get so fatigued that they're not even able to take care of their daily activities and find absolutely no fulfillment in whatever they're doing. So for that reason, I say to all the people at risk, take care of yourself first, because you can only give to the world what you have. If you don't have it in you, you can't give it to the world. So there I emphasize these 7 pillars that I mentioned, sleep, meditation, breathing, yoga, reflection, emotional resilience, understanding that. But what I've also found is if you change your diet, because 99% of genetic information is here and 90% of serotonin comes from your gut, what the Ayurvedic people were saying was totally right. You take care of gut intelligence and it permeates body intelligence and improves your mood. Serotonin is all coming from your 90%. Oxytocin, dopamine, all those things. So from a scientific perspective, those 7 pillars give you resilience so you can do your work. If you get emotionally drained, you can't do anything.
Thank you. I'm going to keep rewatching that because I'm going to keep re-needing that. I appreciate that, though. Lisa, here's a question that came in for you. What do you think about the need for rites of passage for young people, including adolescents, especially at a time when young people might not be raised in a formally religious environment? And how might the expressive arts or interactive guided imagery help young people access a type of spirituality, a sense of belonging in the world, or an ability to make meaning of their life?
Beautiful. I'll start first with the ritual question. Some years ago, I was teaching a class at Columbia, literally in the middle of the class, and there was a knock at the door. And I answered the door, and in my great delight, I saw 9 Navajo girls had shown up with a fellow with a sort of guide for the day. And I invited them in, and they peeked in the class. And when they saw class was actually a bunch of grown-ups, they weren't so sure. But then I shared with them how I'd found my son, Isaiah Lakota, through the help of the Lakota, and they came. So the 9 Navajo girls walked in, and the ringleader was Claire. She was in pink fleece with earpods in. And I said, tell us anything of your culture. Tell us anything that we can learn from you about your Navajo tradition. And she said, oh, I know what is most important. And she stood in front of 70 adults, this 16-year-old girl. When I got my period, proud and strong, my grandmother, she smudged me. And then she said, run here and run there, and put me through tests and challenges for 3 days. I sat in the spirit hut, and I dug a big hole and made a cornbread for my whole village. That's how I knew my bigger spirituality. So body, mind, and soul all connected, coming of age in the eyes of the community. Whether we're talking about bar and bat mitzvah, whether we're talking about confirmation, whether we're talking about what this woman from the Navajo tradition had shared, the idea that with puberty comes an augmented spiritual awareness. For her, standing before her community as a giver, standing before her community as a woman who had arrived physically, and then sitting in the spirit hut for 3 days augmented her deep sense of knowing. She was proud to tell us 70 strangers about coming of age. That is very different from how many young women feel about coming of age. And when we look through the adolescent health survey, a large sample of over 2,000 adolescents, we see that with biological puberty, those girls who build a strong personal spirituality are protected against the spike in depression that otherwise goes hand in hand with coming of age for girls. Onset of menstruation goes hand in hand with a 50% increase in rates of depression, but not for girls for whom this natural coming of age is supported. So it's very, 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 very important. Every tradition has it, and we can draw from our own tradition or create bridges, create transitional moments, shared in community, shared in group. Again, the journey group. Second question was on the creative arts. So as many of you may know, the neurophysiology of creativity has a lot in common with the neurophysiology of spiritual life. The idea that we perceive in a bottom-up way and then discern in a top-down way is both the case in a spiritual sense of journey and is the case in a creative process. And there's a great deal of overlap between being touched by the muse and a spiritually receptive process. So if I don't want to hear anything, I come to you, I'm 17, maybe I'm angry. I don't want to hear anything about religion or even spirituality. If you engage me in the receptive practice, the creative process of catching the muse, you have started to open up a sense of my capacity, the ability of my capacity to engage in the consciousness field and with spirit. Great question.
So we're almost out of time here. So I'm going to ask one final question to the both of you. And as you know, this is a conference for the Institute of Integrative Health and Wellness, a complementary and alternative institute at USC that's both part of the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life and Children's Hospital of Los Angeles, the Keck School of Medicine. You have both been on the front line of these emerging fields, and you've really helped create these fields. For Deepak, it's really complementary and alternative medicine and consciousness studies. Lisa, for you, it's positive psychology and adolescent spirituality. So much has happened in the last 20 years in these fields in terms of data-driven, evidence-based, peer-reviewed research. What advice would you give to all of the practitioners, researchers who are tuning in today about the future of these fields? Where do you think you've seen where they've come from in really dramatic ways. Where should they be going as we move forward? Maybe Deepak, we'll start with you and then we can end with Lisa.
I think it all starts with the personal journey. So, what we talked about ritual. For me, rituals are different in different traditions, but ultimately they have the same intention, discovering our true self. And so in my world right now, the ritual is mantra, tantra, yantra. So tantra is actually ritual, the modalities of ritual. Mantra is our practice, and yantras are modes of rituals that we know. So I would say I see the future where we have a deeper understanding of how ritual shapes identity and ritual shapes the expansion of awareness. I would like to see ritual back in education. I would like to see self-awareness as part of education, starting with very young children. You saw that Lisa said by the age of 6, it's all kind of programmed. And if you're still dysfunctional by 6, then you should run for office. Otherwise, go for rituals. I see the convergence of science and spirituality and more.
The science says that we are innately spiritual beings, and that when our spiritual core is supported and formed, our spiritual hub informs all other lines of development. So the most important thing we can do for the child, for the teen, and at any moment of chapter break, whether it's midlife or into our elderhood, and in times of distress and times of great illumination, moments of transformation, is support the spiritual core. Illness is disintegration. I think we're all in agreement there. And we have radically disintegrated the superordinate, the executive, the spiritual core from all other lines of development, which now fly and blow in the wind, left willy-nilly. We looked around the world. We looked in India, we looked in China, we looked in the US, and all around the world, knowing that spirituality is 1/3 innate, our capacity for spiritual life is innate, we expected to find common phenotypes, and we did. All around the world is a deep sense of love as a mutative force, not just an emotion, is a deep awareness of interconnectedness, of oneness, and then also a practice of transcendence, a morality driven from ultimate truth, and altruism. Well, all around the world, in India and in China, the more years of formal education I have, the more likely I have strengthened my 5 universal phenotypes. Uniquely in the United States, our years of formal education foreclosing. They are inversely associated with the development of spiritual phenotypes. We are educating our children out of spiritual awareness to the great peril and great suffering that they now face. So this is our opportunity. Let's flip this around and make the most important thing we do support for the deep spiritual awareness of children, and all else will follow.
Amen.
Amen. Dr. Deepak Chopra, Dr. Lisa Miller, there could be no better start to this Diwali season than this conversation with the both of you. You've brought so much light and inspiration and wisdom into our lives and into our work. I know I speak on behalf of all of the participants of today's conference and also on behalf of our entire Trojan family, when I really thank you from the bottom of my heart for being with us. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, Dr. Deepak Chopra and Dr. Lisa Miller, for this extraordinary keynote presentation.
It's been a joy and an honor to be with both of you and all of us together here on this Zoom.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And so as we move forward into our conference today, please get yourself a copy of Total Meditation by Deepak Chopra, The Spiritual Child by Lisa Miller. These are gifts that just keep on giving and perfect for the holiday season. Please also note that our conference will continue. We have 55 presenters. We're going to be doing this all day, and there's some extraordinary sessions that are coming up. We're going to take a little break now, but if you go to your program, you can get back on at 11. In the program, all the Zoom links are up and ready, so you can just go straight to the session that you want to go to. Please make sure you cast your ballot for your favorite poster in the poster session before 11:45, because there will be some, we're going to be naming a winner in that. And make sure you check out the virtual cooking and mindful eating session from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. So all that being said, I'm super grateful to all of you. This is the kind of conversation we need right now in our life and in our world. It's really important to know that we have a community, even in our physically distanced world, that shares our hopes and dreams and aspirations. And more than anything, that we can come out of the darkness into the light. We can come out into a new world. Last time I talked to Deepak Chopra, we talked about Shiva, the Hindu god of destruction, but destruction is a precondition for creation. And out of this moment where we feel like we're going through some darkness, that is actually the moment before the rebirth, the new birth of a new consciousness. And I'm very excited to be on this journey with all of you. And so thank you very much to everyone who's made this possible. This was really a beautiful way to start our weekend. And I hope to see you in the future sessions. So please enjoy a little bit of a break, and we'll see you soon. Take care, happy Diwali, and fight on.